want to talk a little bit about two things, and you probably hear it a lot as leaders, disruption and transformation. And I want to begin by going back about 20 years ago when I was living in New York City. I worked in the music industry for a really long time, which people always ask the question, how did you get into technology from the music industry? And it was an interesting time in the late 90s because I worked for a large German company called Bertelsmann Music Group, known as BMG. It's still the largest music publisher in the world. About 10 years ago, they merged with Sony, so most of us know it as Sony Music. It owned two big labels, RCA and Arista. Now, everyone probably knows Arista because anytime American Idol awards a winner, that winner gets their label deal on Arista Records because Arista was owned by Clive Davis, who's sort of a big person in the space. He's really responsible for Kelly Clarkson's career. So I was working at RCA. I was a 24-year-old, probably pompous and arrogant if we think back to how we were in our 20s. Living in New York, sort of a know-it-all, or thought I was a know-it-all. And as we age, I think we become much more humble, which is really important. And I was reading an article in Music Week, which was a UK publication, about a technology called MP3. And I was like, wow, this is fascinating, because this could actually destroy the entire sort of ecosystem that we had known in the music industry, which was really based on physical distribution, CDs, shipping to retailers like Tower Records and Virgin Megastore, as well as independent shops. Then we would go and actually buy those. And I remember thinking to myself, I want to learn a little bit more about this. So I went online, which was interesting at the time because the company that I was at, I remember in 1996 having to tell them, I think everybody needs a computer. I researched a little bit more about what MP3 technology was and how it could maybe affect music distribution. And so fast forward to 1999, I had switched labels and had gone to Virgin, which was infamous in the sense that Richard Branson had owned the company. Interesting story, I was able to bowl with him at one time. He's a fascinating person. He doesn't use a computer. He's dyslexic. He actually writes on his hands to remember things. But he's really wonderful because every time he comes into a group setting, he always talks to people who are at the lowest levels of the company and asks them the interesting questions of what's really going on here, rather than asking people such as yourselves, because you really get to learn what's going on at a company by asking people who do the day-to-day. Regardless, in 1999, I just remember thinking to myself, the music industry was at a peak. It was probably about $7 billion a year, making a lot of money, shipping a lot of albums. But the analogy at that time was the most popular movie in 1999 was Titanic. And that really was going to be the story if we look and see what was happening in the music industry. Because Napster came onto the scene. And a lot of the companies didn't know how to respond to it. And they thought, well, maybe the best way to respond to this is we'll sue it out of existence. We like to think about this with Californication movements. For those who may know the Red Hot Chili Peppers song, Californication, there's a line in there that tidal waves couldn't save the world from Californication. What they're talking about is that most things that come out of the West Coast have a tendency of overtaking the world, and it's hard to stop those. And we've seen that a lot, obviously, recently in a lot of different areas with a lot of different technologies. Uber, Facebook, Amazon, you name it. But the music industry thought, okay, what we'll do is we'll sue Napster out of existence, and then we'll go back to our regular model. And I remember being in a meeting with our label, and I did international marketing at the time, and I said, how are we going to actually address Napster? And our president said, well, what do you mean, how are we going to address Napster? We're suing Napster. And I remember saying, well, should I speak up and say this, or should I just keep to myself and hold on to my job? And I said, well, I sort of respectfully disagree. I think we should go buy Napster. And of course, everyone looked at me like, this guy's gone. And the president said to me later, don't come back to any of these meetings. You made everybody look like, a fool. Well, fast forward 3 years, it's 2002, it's post 9/11, and I'm laid off from my job because the music industry is pretty much gone. It's been decimated by this technology. Napster's overtaken. Most people have moved toward file sharing. The music industry is still trying to ship physical units. And a year later, a person by the name of Steve Jobs comes on the scene and sort of rescues it by issuing the iPod and iTunes. And the rest is sort of history. We now know that we're in sort of a streaming world, and that world is constantly has totally changed. But the interesting learning from all of this was a $7 billion industry now is probably worth about $2 billion. But it could have been worth $4 billion if those labels had actually said, how do we reimagine what our vertical is? They hadn't really thought about that. They just wanted to sort of stick with what had worked rather than seeing what was coming. And the other big learning too is ideas on the fringe, even though we think, okay, let's just ignore those, they're going to go away, should now be accepted as a virtue in a company. So this is where people who come up with crazy ideas, who might be a little bit more on the transparent side, should be listened to. Their ideas might not necessarily be correct, but it's a good place, I think, for us as leaders now to say, hold on a second, tell me more about that, because that could be an area that we could get into, or it could ultimately change our business for the better. Not everything in a disruptive world necessarily has to be bad if we can actually adapt to it, if we have the mental liquidity to actually adapt to it. So in terms of some of these fringe ideas, I think if the labels had thought, okay, how do we go out and actually buy Napster and make it our distribution model? One of those labels would have actually survived, or I think many of them actually may have survived because they would have been at the cutting edge of where things were going. It also may have reshaped how technology groups have really had much more control over what we do in our day-to-day, because it actually took Apple to sort of improvise that world that we live in now rather than the labels themselves. And if we think about labels, they're still around, they still exist, but they have no power. They're really sort of like management companies. They still sign artists. But most artists now can make it on their own because they have a whole vast ecosystem known as the internet and the social web that they can take advantage of. So these fringe ideas, again, I want you to think about how you pay attention to those. What are the trends in your industry? And they touch everything. Not just, the example I'm using is just in music, but they're everywhere now, whether you work in telecommunications, health, manufacturing. There's a lot of things that we have to actually pay attention to in terms of what are the new processes that we can put into place? What is the new thinking that we can actually consider for our organization? And how do we take advantage of that rather than saying, hey, Jeff, get out of the conference room. We don't need you in here because you're embarrassing everyone. That type of learning and relearning is really what allows us, I think, to adapt and survive in the new business world that we live in. And it is a fascinating place. I think that's what one of the fun things that I learned from those early years in the music industry. And from that, seeing that technology and how it was actually changing things really got me into the world that I'm in now, because I sort of identified, well, music distribution is going to move online. And so my next job was actually in the startups world in New York City, working for a digital distribution company. So I sort of pivoted away from where music had been into this new area. So I want you to think as leaders, how do you pivot? How do you pivot your organization? How do you pivot as your own personal brand? What are the things that you can do to learn from all the change that we have going on around us?